welcome to the Dingle Animation Festival. It's my pleasure to introduce to you an artist whose work boasts huge titles, household names, the kind of projects we all wish we could have been a part of, and whose talent seems to effortlessly and seamlessly move from one media to another. If you were in a traditional festival setting, I'd ask you all to clap hands and welcome Mr. Brendan McCarthy. Brendan, how are you? Thank you very much for joining us.
Great, thanks. I'm very well, thank you.
So I'd like to kick off almost straight away here because you have quite a lot of work that's really worthy of the time to talk about. And I think we could be here for the weekend talking about what you've covered. So we'll try and cover as much as we can in the time kind of comfortably. So I think a good place to start is usually at the beginning. And we will start somewhere around your Sometimes Stories.
Right, okay, yeah. That was, when I was a kid, I had a big interest in comics, films, music, animation. I particularly wanted to get something into print. So when I left art college, where I studied painting in London, we got backed by a comic book shop owner to produce our own indie comic. I've been raised on the usual mixture of American comics, British comics, and the underground comics of the 60s. But when we were putting out this indie comic called Sometimes Stories, which was all of it created by myself and Brett Ewins, we wanted to do something that was more in tune with the times, and things like David Bowie and all that stuff was going on. So that was a big influence on this stuff. So it was a break from the underground independent stuff and was, if you like, a proto-Vertigo type of comic. And that's how we kicked off. Was only one of these existed. We did do the second issue, but it ended up in some kind of calamity. But the main thing was to get into print. And then once you were in print, you could then show a sample of your work. And then at the time, when as we were doing Sometimes Stories, punk rock broke really big in 1976 to 77. It was all the Sex Pistols. Everybody was doing torn up blackmail lettering and all that kind of stuff. And I noticed a music paper called Sounds had a comic strip in it. And that comic strip stopped. The guy who was doing it stopped doing it. So I basically wrote to him and said, do you want a new punk type of comic strip? And they said, sure, send us some samples. I created the Electric Hoax and sold it to Sounds. So that was my first sale. And I've been doing that operation ever since, just coming up with crazy stuff and then seeing if anybody will buy it. So the Electric Hoax was a kind of an idea of a punk rock strip using a lot of the techniques of the punk rock look that was prevalent at the time, as I say, the torn up lettering and the very abrasive black and white look, as you see in that strip. Later on, a mate of mine who I'd met through Brett Ewins called Peter Milligan, I got him to start writing the strip with me, and gradually we formed a creative partnership and went on to do a load of work through that led us into the 80s. And that was the big era of the British invasion. You've got 2000 AD up. Obviously, at the time, 2000 AD was the place to strut your stuff to get noticed and seen. And this is probably my most famous cover from 2000 AD, which at the time was quite a groundbreaking cover. I finally got to take control of the coloring. So that was a really big step forward for me. And 2000 AD,
color is such a big part of what you do as well. It's a huge identity to what you do. So
right. I mean, to me, like not being to have a hand over the coloring is like, to me it's crazy, But from 2000 AD, of course, like almost the entire 80s superstar writers and creators emerged from 2000 AD, what they called the British invasion in America into the comics industry, which revolutionized the industry and created the whole graphic novel industry. It all came, people like Alan Moore, Garth Ennis, Grant Morrison, Mark Miller, massive names, Brian Bolland, Mike McMahon, all these fantastic artists, writers, basically all passed through the doors of 2000 AD and then on to the big American publishers. The biggest character, of course, in 2000 AD, and the kind of one we all looked to, that was what you read. I mean, 2000 AD was one of those things where some weeks it would be really bad. There would just be loads of crappy scripts, but there's always Judge Dredd. And so getting to draw Judge Dredd was a big aim of mine at the time, and eventually I managed to get that done as well. And again,
did you do the colors on this as well? Because it's kind of funny to see a not really dark, grim Judge Dredd. This is kind of a very colorful, still grim, but
the colors on the left-hand side are all by me, and the colors on the right, I work with a guy called Mark Harrison, who's a fantastic colorist. I've started to work with colorists recently, and I'm very into letting colorists do their stuff. That's why when I'm working with another colorist, I don't over-render on the artwork, with loads of fiddly lines and stuff, because it forces the colorists into a lighter palette. Whereas if I leave lots of open space for them, they can actually do their color effects and really go wild. So with certain comic strips, which you'll see later, like The Sorcerer of Zilk, that's where I let a colorist really give them room to do their stuff. And that's an Irish guy, Len O'Grady. Yeah, he's a really fantastic.
He so aped your style so well. It's flawless. It's really good.
No, Len's great. He's really good, and he's an artist unto himself. So why should I be sort of? All I want to do is amplify him rather than clamp him down.
Yeah. So there was a whole collection that you're working.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just about 5 years ago, they put together all my stuff. So it's got quite a bit of the crappy early stuff, much to my embarrassment. But in one way, I think, well, okay, it shows aspiring comic guys is that you don't have to be a genius on your first page, and eventually you get better as you go along with it. And that was the cover of the compilation of my Judge Dredd strips,
which is again, very gritty Judge Dredd stuff, obviously, but full of color and stuff. Again, it's a real hallmark to your style. It's
well, yeah. I think it's important as well to develop a style. I used to spend hours practicing my signature. Everybody does secretly, and yeah, I mean that's the thing is you want to develop a distinctive style so that we can go, oh, that's his stuff. You can, when you see a Brian Bolland, you can tell it's a Bolland straight away. Yeah. Or a Mike Mignola,
But I think that there's a lot of guys coming from the British invasion at the time where I think they were all looking at the same kind of material. They all had the same kind of style, but then your stuff, you were looking at different stuff. There was a whole different array of influences and.
Well, because I'd been to art college, I'd looked at painting, and I was particularly interested in the surrealists, the Dadaists, which tied in with the punk stuff, but also the colorists, like the Fauvists and the post-impressionists. So I understood that color could be more than just filling in black lines, and as I say, part of my style is the distinctive use of color. I mean, I was massively influenced by the animated feature film Yellow Submarine. I don't know if you know or not. I think it's my personal favorite animated film ever. And what's interesting about Yellow Submarine is that it's not particularly well animated. It's very crude. But I mean, apart from the brilliance of the soundtrack, it's the production designs by Heinz Eidelman, which really holds that film together. It's still, to me, I have actually had to stop watching it because it's too influential on me.
Yeah, I want a point of inspiration to plagiarism kind of stuff, is it? Or you kind of have to put it away, or you just kind of take too much from it?
Yeah. Sometimes it can, your work won't change otherwise. And so I've stopped looking basically at Heinz Eidelman's work, who's the Yellow Submarine designer, and Steve Ditko's work, who was the psychedelic 60s Doctor Strange guy. I thought, I've got to stop looking at these guys or I'll end up just keep doing that stuff forever. And, I've wanted to allow different influences to come in the last few years. Strange enough, Alfred Bestel, the artist and writer of Rupert Bear, he's the classic one. He's become... I became quite enamored of him, actually, where having spent so long in America, in Hollywood, that when I came back to England, I was struck by the Englishness of his work, how beautiful it was. And that very understated English style of illustration has now sort of become a big influence on me, particularly in the last strip I did for 2000 AD.
Interesting. That's not something you associate with D. It's very good. Something a little bit different again. Then we'll go into your work on Freakwave.
Yeah.
This was something I was aware of before I knew I had an opportunity to talk to you. This is brilliant. I was very late to this as well.
Right.
But this drifter, really really nice, kind of that dark gritty stuff again. Not your surreal setting. This was kind of more in a real world, post-apocalyptic water world, I guess.
Well, this was done before Waterworld, basically.
Say it again, sorry.
I said it was done before Waterworld.
It was, yeah. God, the potential that film could have had if it was come to you.
Yeah. But the one of the interesting things about Freakwave is the sort of obviously it's Mad Max influence, but it's one of the biggest films that blew me away when I was about 20 or so was Mad Max 2 Road Warrior. I'd never seen a movie like it, and it had a profound influence on me. And then, of course, later on, I'd come to write the Fury Road movie. So it's strange. Somehow, I think sometimes fate is lurking in the background of things. As you get older, you start to think, that's a bit strange.
There was like an awful lot of Eisner-esque lettering in your work as well that I'm a big fan of. You don't just kind of leave that to another person as well. Much like your collaborative there with the colorist, you give them
I'm not the letterer. It's something I haven't, to be honest with you, lettering is the last thing I haven't quite got my head around. I want to do it because I do get frustrated with lettering in comics when I produce art and the lettering's placed in a space that I didn't intend it to be put in, that kind of stuff. So I think future comics, I'm going to get more of a hand in designing the lettering. I've done it once on a Marvel one, a Spider-Man story where I had artistic control of the lettering with a very good graphic designer called Steve Cook. So that was nice. I could sit with him and we could work the lettering out. So I was able to push the lettering in the strip. But generally, you tend to get letterers who, most of them are competent, but I guess in my mind I have a different view of what the lettering can be.
Yeah. But have you written in the Freakwave? Is that drawn in by you, or is that added by a letterer?
Oh, the logo at the top, the Freakwave Eisner-esque logo, as you pointed out, it was by me, but the actual caption and word balloon lettering is by a letterer.
And like, what's your maybe this is a throwback to your fine art here, where you kind of have a collage type opening here, where his hair has a blend into the shadow around him and then into the wave. What's your technique for laying out a page for this kind of stuff?
Well, that's what's called a splash page. It's, obviously it's Freakwave, no pun intended, but generally with a splash page, you want to kind of, you tend to want to establish the character. So sometimes a headshot maybe in the background with the foreground character, you're getting from that then, okay, he's some kind of surf warrior, he goes around on a windsurfer, and within the story just kicks straight into it. And it's, as I say, it's basically a Mad Max on water.
And there's more settings here.
And that's more of a traditional comic page layout. You've got your big establishing shot at the top where I wanted to show an African style stilt village, but made out of Greyhound buses and vehicles. And then you've got this catamaran VW chugging into the shot. And then, introducing characters. It's just basic dialogue stuff. So you just want to get the characters and establish them, facial expressions. I mean, that's the interesting thing about comics, is such a good discipline for if you then go into movies, designing movies or animated series or whatever. With a comic, you've got to invent, in my case, I invent the concept, work the story out, co-write the script or work with a writer on the script. You've got to design all the characters, design the world, do the color. There's so much you've got to do everything in a comic. So when you go onto an animated show, you think, wow, this is, compared to comics, this is pretty straightforward.
It's a smaller piece of the pie, so you get to do a little bit more in a little piece.
Exactly. Yes.
We'll move on to your work on Strange Days, more Freakwave stuff, um, more kind of, we're seeing some kind of dreamy psychedelic
Yeah.
art emerge in your work at this point, which kind of becomes a theme throughout your work for the rest. What kind of brought that kind of material into what was kind of a more traditional looking reading comic?
Well, it was me coming into my own style and more confidence in my own creations and take on the world. And also, I was lucky at that time to have a great writing partner. We were like creative partners, myself and Peter Milligan, who's gone on to become a very big name in comics. Freakwave, although it started off as a quite realistic, fantasy derived from Mad Max, but in a way, I was trying to show the American audience that I could do classic American type strips. And so once I'd done that, I felt like, I've said this now, I'm quite a sort of a restless creator, and I'm constantly trying to innovate and try new things. So with Freakwave, I started to get involved in the area around the image itself, what they call the gutter. That started to interest me because generally it's dead space, it's just left white. And I wanted to, like, that was one of the pages I was very pleased with, where I'm laying out the panels, but I started to now get into the relationship of the text to the panels, where it's inside a panel, then it's free floating text, then there's word balloons, and then how I started to use the gutter to go into the background behind the panels with all those diagonal lines and stuff. One of the things to note with this is all pre-Photoshop. And I was taking a leaf out of Matisse, who used to do, towards the end of his life, he used to cut out colored paper due to his impaired vision. And he could, with a pair of scissors, he'd cut up bits of colored paper and paste them together and make pictures of colored paper pasted together. So I basically lifted that technique and literally cut out with scissors. I'd have to imagine how the yellow paper would lay on top of basically this white paper at the base. Then I put some orange on, then some black, then some yellow, and then the last thing I put on was the vertical blue line to the left. So that was an interesting thing where I was using a fine art technique into a comic book to create a different look, and not relegate that gutter area just to be neutral white.
Very interesting. Gives a whole different sense of time on the page, which I guess is what the gutter's supposed to do. That's really interesting. Well,
I think the gutter's meant to be, in traditional comics, it's usually white, meaning don't look at this, only look at the stuff inside the panel. Whereas I see, now that I've opened up the gutter in my work, and lots of people do it now as well, but for me, it almost fulfills the role of, say, incidental music in a film. Like, the grammar of a film is, you don't think there's an orchestra somewhere down the stairs as the guy's walking up the stairs and you hear creepy music. The grammar of film is that you accept that the music is separate to the drama, and that it's there to enhance the mood of suspense or happiness or whatever the music's doing. So with the gutter here, when you read the strip, you're kind of reading what's in the inside the panel, the art, but at the same time, you're taking in subliminally the background gutter effect. And as I became more interested in that, I started to use it to create atmospheres. If I'm in, I might want to, if I'm in a sequence that I want to be quite psychedelic, I might then go very psychedelic in the gutter. I'm a little bit more simple in the frames, but you're taking in the information in the gutter when you're actually reading the comic as well.
That's really interesting, because then you're not imposing your psychedelic use in the interior panels themselves, so it kind of keeps your storytelling crystal clear, which is actually really good. It's really interesting. I've never heard of anyone doing that, actually, cutting out.
Well, I think people.
That's really cool.
Yes, I think it was looking at in the 80s there was a movement, with artists like Bill Sienkiewicz, Frank Miller, etc., where they were, we were all starting to bleed off doing big shots where the art would bleed off the edge of the page. And that's a lot to do with printing techniques improving, so that registration was pretty accurate by then. Before that, if you look at the 60s comics, artists like Kirby and Ditko, these kinds of guys, they would draw within a sort of an invisible frame, so that if the page drifted on the printing, it wouldn't go off page. You'd still see the entire
important parts of the story on the page that get lost.
Yeah.
So we'll move on to Paradox then, which I think is actually one of those things that still feels, and a lot of your work still feels like it could be very relevant today. Like this, I feel like it could talk about, reality TV meets The Boys would be a great pitch for this. I think, we have a celebrity super kid star just kind of losing the run of himself a bit. He's a bit of a bad boy.
Yeah, I mean, Paradox was in the comic Strange Days, which is sort of at the time was what they call a cult comic, meaning it didn't sell huge, but lots of people were influenced by it. Paradox was my attempt at a superhero, and I was dissatisfied with the superhero genre. I did like it, but I felt it was a bit by now become quite boring and redundant. So the idea was, it was like, well, what would happen if just a regular guy became a superhero, and who's also a bit of a yob? He's not, he's only in it for fame, money, and can he get laid loads of times? That sort of stuff. That kind of mentality, becoming a superhero. At the time, hip hop music was breaking out in New York. Grandmaster Flash and all that stuff was happening. I'd not actually been to New York by that stage, but generally it was coming from looking at movies like Taxi Driver. So Paradox was a very it was light-hearted. It was bad boy. It was, there he is puffing on a giant joint, plotting how he can be, two-time his girlfriend, how he's going to become more famous than the biggest star ever. So that's all. So it was all that. It's been ripped off loads of times, Paradox, that whole idea. But at the time, this was completely brand new. And Paradox, it kind of got buried by the Watchmen, really, because Watchmen came out and everybody was into, how great it was. And it is. It's a great piece of work. So Paradox tended to be a bit in the shadows, but lots of creators. Other creators noticed it and took it on board, and then you saw strips like Zenith. And there were lots of innovations in Paradox, which I see if you look at Into the Spider-Verse.
Oh, yeah.
Things like superheroes wearing jackets and sneakers over their costumes. It came from Paradox. That's where that idea was first entered into the culture. And gradually that then went into the Spider-Man comic. And then from the comic, they derived that and put it into the Spider-Verse. So that has been interesting for me to watch how things percolate into culture.
It's another one of those things where you've done so much and it still feels so relevant. I'd imagine a lot of your work still feels like you can see it in other things today, and where other people are referencing your work from. I thought this was another piece of yours that I feel has popped up quite a lot in a lot of things. Characters like Moon Knight, where they have talking nobodies, these floating devices behind them, and this guy has this raven talking to them as he's
well, that was a reference to T.S. Eliot and the Hollow Men, the famous poem.
Very good.
And so we wanted to, at the time when that strip was drawn, the Smiths had become really big, and Morrissey was selling, he was the Pope of Mope, as they called him. And so the idea of being really depressing and people going, oh my God, here he comes, this terribly depressing person. We turned that into a character called Jack Empty, whose insides have been hollowed out by this raven, who's a death symbol. So he's basically the idea that a supervillain, his power is to completely depress and demoralize you. That was the joke, So Paradox there is being completely depressed and wanting to give up, and that's how that guy's superpower works.
I'm starting to see a bit of a theme there. So your first work was in a Sounds, the magazine, and you're referencing more music here. Did music play a big part in your influence and how you draw or take inspiration?
Yeah, music is probably the biggest influence on my work out of everything. Particularly the period I grew up through. So I was a kid in the 1960s. So, I heard the Beatles as a kid, just as they were releasing their records. And I remember I can vividly remember listening to Abbey Road when I was a kid, liking Maxwell's Silver Hammer and hating the more sophisticated stuff. And now, obviously, Maxwell's Silver Hammer is unlistenable. But so music and the iconography of music, particularly David Bowie, he was a massive influence on my view of comics. Basically, I was thinking, why can't comics be as smart and as artistic and as commercial as David Bowie? So he was a huge yardstick creatively for me in terms of what I wanted to do with comics at that time. I mean, a lot of the innovations one makes, I'm now talking 30 years ago, are new and different back then, and they become absorbed into the mainstream because the mainstream will always absorb the avant-garde. And so they're not as sort of radical as they were back then. So you look at it, you go, okay, I get that idea. And, you can also see the Yellow Submarine influence of the surrealists, the rows of ties and, the zigzag trousers and all that kind of stuff.
So it probably should be more obvious to me now when I was looking up your work about how much that should have been clear in your work. But as we go on, we'll look at some of your work here as well, Sooner or Later, a collection of stories.
Yeah, that was Sooner or Later. Myself and Pete Milligan came up with this idea. Again, this is over 30 years ago. So you're looking at a time when Margaret Thatcher was in power and unemployment had gone through the roof. And we came up with this idea of, wouldn't it be fun if the Conservative government sent the unemployed into the future as a way of getting rid of them? So they've invented time travel and they dump the unemployed in the future where they assume there'll be more jobs. And so it's about this layabout guy who's not that bothered about getting a job, but he's forced to, in those days you were forced to look for work. So he basically gets sent into the future, and it's about him not looking for a job and wandering about. It was a very picaresque tale. It was a satire. It started off, they gave us 6 pages to kick the story off in 2000 AD, and then it migrated to the back cover. Well, we could do anything we wanted, really. So, and the layouts were crazy. We would do, and it was a little, it wasn't a major strip in 2000 AD, but it had its own cult following. Like, like a page like that was typical on the back page of 2000 AD. So, and you can see how inventive it was. The characters upside down, the lettering's backwards, the panel layouts are different. I worked on that page particularly with a very good artist called Tony Wright, who was coming as well. He was part of our crew when we were doing Strange Day. He was, he was part of that kind of scene we were in. And he did some stuff for 2000 AD, but he went on to, he's a masterful storyteller and went into storyboarding and became just one of the top storyboard artists in the UK. Did everything, Harry Potter, Star Wars, just tons of great stuff. He's very, very good.
You keep mentioning people you work with. I just kind of want to point out the fact that even though comics is kind of seen as a solitary workload, you seem to be surrounded by people you're bouncing ideas off or working with specifically on the page. Can you talk a bit more about it? You mentioned Brett, you mentioned Peter. These are all people you seem to be in contact with since college, up to current day. Can you talk a bit more about that? Maybe how you were working with them and how you continue to?
It was. It's really just they were friends, and we used to hang around. But we were all artists, and we all shared the same vision that comics, from that kind of idea of comics could be more like David Bowie or the Beatles, then they had to be, British comics, that you got to remember, was also really tedious. It was also full of football stories and war stories, and they were still going on about the Germans, all this sort of stuff. And you think, oh God, when's it ever going to end? And so the comics we were doing were really ahead of the game back then, and now they look, I suppose that's why they look so contemporary now, is they were ahead of the game back then, but now times have caught up. And, so they look kind of their time kind of now. A lot of my stuff, I feel if it came out now, it'd still look good.
Absolutely. And I think you tackle subjects that are quite big and other areas, but can be very relatable to current stuff today. Like, I was late to Skin. I only read Skin in the last couple of years.
Right.
And I absolutely blew me away.
Oh,
It was one of those books I picked up kind of on a whim. I wasn't even sure who had written it or who had worked on it. Seeing your kind of bullseye circular motif on this, I really should have copped it from the get-go. But you like really tackle something quite huge here with regards to a birth defect, and like, it's a fun book. It's a book that's weirdly both nominated for an Eisner, I think, and banned.
yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, Skin became probably the most notorious comic of the 80s, that 80s boom period of comics when all the innovation, Watchmen and Love and Rockets and all that stuff was happening. There was a great editor at 2000 AD who took over, a guy called Steve McManus, and they've decided to do a new comic called Crisis, which is going to be a bit more political. Pat Mills had done something called Third World War, I think it was called, which was, that was a bit more standard left-wing agitprop type university politics type strip. But we approached, Steve had said to us, do you have anything that might be a bit more in keeping with this more of a political thing? We said, well, I had this idea about, when I was growing up, my mother could have taken the drug thalidomide. It was sold on the market as a drug to stop morning sickness in women, but it hadn't been properly tested when they put it out, and it had these side effects where it penetrated into the placenta and created these horrific birth defects in babies. So the mildest birth defects we saw were the children who were born with phocomelia, which is the foreshortened limbs, usually on the arms. That's the mildest. When you read about thalidomide, it's really hardcore. I mean, kids were born with their internal organs on the outside of their bodies. That was the hardcore stuff, like really disgusting. What made it worse is that the company then set about trying to take down the parents who had decided to do a class action lawsuit against the company. And then they started divide and rule, buying off some of them, doing all this it was absolutely corporate greed at its worst, corporate violence, corporate greed. And these people were trying to get away with it. And so that was the background, of the health issue. When I was growing up, for around about 1971, I think it was, Skinheads started to appear when it was a group of young whites and and black Caribbeans who were forming this new sort of youth thing based around reggae music, ska music, which then evolved into reggae and then evolved into dub. There was a kid who I'd see walking around near where I was growing up, who was thalidomide, but had adopted skinhead clothing because there were these shirts called Ben Sherman shirts that had short sleeves. Oh. So he could put them on and his little hands would stick out of the sleeves. And I didn't know him, but I saw him a few times and thought, and that image stuck with me. I thought, what's that story? What's the story of, skinheads who are, ultra violent and terrible? And what about the corporate violence that produced that kid? Why is that less terrible than skinheads? So that was the basic idea we were going in with. I told the story to Pete Milligan. I'd worked this whole story out, and I knew the ending wrote itself. It was now and then you get one where the whole thing comes to you complete, the story. And we talked about it, how don't do it, just let's do it as a working class kid and what it's like to be that kid. What about his rage? What about the fact that he's been abandoned by society? Nobody will look at him, touch him. He's at that age, he's just going into puberty where, he probably craves touch. He wants someone to touch his skin, and hence the title, the double meaning of the title, skinhead and skin. And so we decided to write it in a full barrel working class way. So it's got lots of swearing. It's completely politically incorrect. Well, political correctness didn't really exist back then. Again, this is 30 years ago. So, and it was, we felt it was like, one of our best pieces. It was really, heartfelt. It's one of the most emotionally strong comics I think that's ever been done. It's very affecting emotionally. And that's what we wanted. We wanted this comic to be really crude and direct. And we even structured the story so it truncates at the end, so it ends too quickly. Just like his body is truncated. So all those themes went inside the writing of Skin. And so Steve McManus, he thought, wow, he recognized how powerful it was and said, thanks, this is fantastic. And then he approved it. It was going to appear in Crisis magazine, and the union who printed the comics 2000 AD were looking at it, and then when they started reading it, they said, "This is disgusting. We're not printing this," And they all decided to threaten strikes. They got their lawyers in. They said, "We can't print this. This is obscene." And then they basically said, they basically just said, "We're not working on this," and down tools and all the rest of it. So the strip had to be pulled out, gets banned from 2000 AD. All the lawyers at the company that owned 2000 AD are suddenly in a tizzy. Steve McManus is in deep trouble as the editor. Thankfully he didn't lose his job, but, and our strip, by then I'd drawn the entire strip and we've done it all. And although, it can be a good, hey, wasn't it great getting banned? Isn't it cool? At the same time, when you're a freelance guy and you're surviving on, porridge most of the time, it was a big blow financially. So, it was extra porridge for about a month after Skin getting banned. And the story got picked up by the alternative press in music papers and Time Out magazines that were prevalent at the time, and it became a bit of a cause célèbre. And at that same time, graphic novels were kicking off as a new thing, and people, Watchmen had been marketed as a graphic novel, and all the publishers were now looking for graphic novels. So suddenly we got this lineup of, the Penguin books and all these sort of the hipsters. In those days, they didn't really know the scene. It was like, 5 years before they would have turned their noses up at comics, but now everybody wanted graphic novels.
Yeah.
So they all formed a queue to try and get hold of Skin, and every single one, when they read it, said, "See you later, get lost." We're not publishing this. And so we couldn't get it published anywhere. And so the book became a bit like the central character, completely untouchable. And how it eventually got published was that a few years later I worked. One of my first films I worked on was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I worked with the director on working out what the turtles looked like, how we could make them work, the animatronic turtles work in the movie, and they worked really well. And they were, it came across. And the movie was huge. It was one of the biggest independent movies ever made, because it was financed out of Hong Kong or something. And it made a bucket load of dough. And Kevin Eastman was just, rolling in money, and decided to set up his own publishing company called Tundra.
Tundra, yeah, okay.
And, I'd met Kevin, and, he'd been really pleased with what we'd done on the movie for him. And, and I said, I'd mentioned Skin and what had happened to it. And he said, "Well, look, we'll publish it." So I said, "Are you sure? It could get a lot of trouble out of this." And he said, no, it's okay. So Kevin really got really involved in it. And his lawyers then, we arranged for it to be printed. It was going to be printed overseas, but to import it into the UK, it would have to go through customs. And so we wrote to customs and sent them some samples and said, "Is this going to be okay?" And they said, "If you import this, we're going to do you for obscenity." Oh, God. So Kevin Eastman, to his credit, said, "You know what? I'm going to fight a court case over this. Let's do it." And he wrote back to the customs, said, "This level of censorship is ridiculous. For a comic, if you look at the comic, it's actually about something worthwhile. And they, weirdly enough, they backed off."
Oh, well, good on him.
Yeah. And it's to Kevin's credit that he had the balls to do it. And, basically he had deep pockets. He had the money to.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
Because this kind of book should see light of day. God, it's horrible to hear that it almost didn't get out.
Yeah, and then it came out. It was really well received. Eventually, sold its run, and then has more recently, about I think it was about 6 years ago, there was a great big compilation of all that 80s work I did with Peter Milligan. And Skin was republished in the book called The Best of Milligan and McCarthy, and it's all intact in there. Plus, pretty much all the best stuff we did of that era is all in one book. It's a great compilation, actually. That's sold out as well as far as I can get. It's going for quite a lot of money now on Amazon and eBay.
Brilliant. I think that's in here as well. We'll come across that too.
Yeah.
We'll move on to another hit, Rogan Gosh. This is really iconic for you're really hitting you at a psychedelic style you have. There's a kind of a feeling of a thinking like the passive thought on the page, kind of like Ulysses almost, you know. Please tell us a bit about this and your technique and your use of color again, please, because it's such an important part to this.
Yeah, I mean, and Rogan Gosh now looks really contemporary, particularly as you know, ethnic cultures are now coming in mainstream. What was different about Rogan Gosh at the time is where I grew up in London, in West London. Next door to me was Southall, which was the biggest Indian community in London. And I'd go down there on a regular basis on the bus. It was about 5 bus stops down the road, and I knew these Indian kids down there. I'd have a collection of Marvel comics and DC comics, and I'd trade, you know, my American comics for their Indian comics, because that was a big thing. As far as I knew, I was the only person who seemed to know about Indian comics, and so I used to collect Indian comics, and I talked to Pete about let's do an Indian sci-fi, because I was aware of, because of that contact with Southall and Indian culture, I knew about Bollywood. And this is well before all the hipsters got hold of Bollywood, and now it's fairly mainstream. But back then, this was completely unique, because nobody had cast a lead as an Indian guy as the lead in a British comic before. And the idea was to do Indian sci-fi, but from the perspective of myself and Pete Milligan, who are 2 British guys, working class British guys, whose most people's knowledge of Indian culture is going down the Indian restaurant on a Friday night when you're pissed off your face so you can get some more drink because they're open longer than the pubs. You know, so we wanted to bring that culture in and then mix it up with Indian stuff. So it became a time travel story, where basically an English lout who's basically drinking lager drunk in an Indian restaurant is propelled into the future India, which is all sort of minareted sci-fi worlds. Here's the central character, Rogan Gosh, which is named after an Indian meal. It's a lamb curry. And he's a Carminaut. A Carminaut's a bit like a Terminator, except they travel through the reincarnated lives of their pasts. So they use up lives. And the character holding the lager glass there is, I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he's the lout. And it's a story about, both of us are very interested in the Vedanta, which is the Hindu spiritual religion, and we both, myself and Pete Milligan, were independently interested in, you know, philosophy and spirituality and those kinds of things. And we wanted to do a comic that was actually an account of spiritual enlightenment and elements of it. In the case of the lout, he also gets spiritually enlightened and comes to know the Vedantic concept of enlightenment, of, you know, where the personal identity is subsumed in a kind of oneness, as it's called, but who surrenders his oneness to go back to being a lout so that he can apologize to his girlfriend and eventually tell her that he loves her, you know. So he sacrifices, if you like, universal enlightenment for personal love. And the Indian waiter, who is the central character, is the prior life of this Carminaut, and he takes on the role of Carminaut in the future India. So that's the sort of fate. What people found a bit sticky about the comic was that we decided to also get rid of one narrator as the central focus of the story and use 4 different narrators, each of which have equal weight in the story. So you start off the story thinking it's about something, and then it cuts to another narrator and his story, and you think the story's, oh, it's about this guy. And then it cuts to the next person. You think, oh, it's about her. And then you think, oh, it's about this guy who only exists. One of the narrators only exists in the panels. We never see him.
Oh,
so we were playing a lot of meta games, and it really, after Skin, which was a very simple, direct story, very emotional, we wanted to do something that was really complex, like a tapestry that wove in and out of itself. It owed a big deal to the film Performance, if you know that 60s, quite a psychedelic 60s movie. Do you know it at all?
I don't know it. No, sorry.
Highly recommend it. Really go and get it out and watch it. It's a really good mind trip.
All right, check it out.
Yeah, Mick Jagger and James Fox.
I'll give that a go. I didn't know he was in one. This is one of the pages in the book that I'd like to talk about. Just kind of more of you using your motifs, your circles, again, your bullseyes, as I call them to myself. I don't know if you call them anything else. But again, your use of color. Again, you have these great little kind of white tints that pop up now and again. That's very uniquely you. Big, loud colors, and what you're doing again here with the text, I think, is really interesting. But there's a real feel of. I was trying to find the right word there a minute ago. I think I caught it as you were talking. There's a real feel of a stream of consciousness throughout this whole book, and the pages that I have picked up and read and gone through. It's a really interesting, far more psychedelic take than some of your other pieces leading up to this point as well. I feel like you're really hitting the crescendo here.
Yeah, I think that this was the last major strip I did in that 80s run. You have a kind of, most people have a kind of hot streak in their career, and mine was the 80s run in, that's when it was all fresh. We were breaking the barriers. Graphic novels are taking off. I mean, it's something that happens. You'll see it a lot. I was lucky enough to hit a couple of these periods in my life where when artists and creators make innovations like you saw it in 60s pop music and things like that, the corporations are scrabbling to catch up. They don't know what's happening. I don't know what the kids are doing, but just throw money at them, that kind of thing. Then eventually the corporations take power, and then they start to control everything. So that innovates a lot. You saw it with the internet. Internet 25 years ago was the Wild West. Now it's censorship, and you're not allowed to look at this, and you can't do that, this and the other, So in the 80s, the creators were making all the moves, and the industry was running to catch up. And the graphic novel concept was innovated. There were a couple of key players within the corporation. Jeanette Kahn, the publisher of DC, was fantastic, a greatly underestimated exec, and Karen Berger, 2 women who were crucial to the expansion of comics because they were smart enough to let it happen. But really, it's down to the creators themselves who were innovating, and the comic industry had to accommodate it. Hence, with Alan Moore writing these big tomes like Watchmen, you then gave birth to the graphic novel. And it was really Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns that drove the graphic novel. And then Skin could be marketed as a graphic novel, Rogan Gosh, etc. So, yeah, Rogan Gosh was a kind of, was the last big one I did in that period. And then I followed it up, and coming off Rogan Gosh, Vertigo did a collection of Rogan Gosh finally as a Vertigo thing. In those days, Vertigo, the only reason we allowed it to happen is that we kept the copyright. And I was very strong about owning my own work as well. So that I retained the copyright with Pete Milligan of all that classic 80s stuff. So originally, myself and Pete Milligan pitched Shade the Changing Man. We were going to take this slightly obscure Ditko strip that DC had published in the 70s, and we were going to revamp it. In the end, I decided I didn't want to get involved in doing a monthly American comic, as I was feeling a bit burnt out, really, and I wasn't going to own anything. So I agreed to do the covers. And so I just sort of went full bore on the covers and just let it just go full psychedelic, bring in sort of techniques of Andy Warhol, Jamie Reed, the punk guy behind the Sex Pistols images. So you see that on the right, that's much more Jamie Reed. The one on the left is a bit more Ditko, innovating with the lettering. starting to really, and also, again, this is all pre-Photoshop. So what was coming online at that stage were color photocopiers. If you went to certain printers that had these, there were only about half a dozen color photocopiers in London at the time. If you went there, you could get them to flood, they could mess around with the colors and flood the colors and oversaturate. So I would do that, and I'd produce about, say, half a dozen versions of the cover, pick the best one, and I'd send the color photocopies, what was sent to DC. You actually, in those days, send the physical artwork to be photographed. And they would get a color photocopy, which they would then reproduce as the color art. So that's why they have that particular look to them.
Very good. When you were mentioning the women in DC there, I thought that was the cue to go to these, but it's great to see that modern technique on someone like Ditko as well, who I know is a big inspiration to you. That must have been a really fun character to get your teeth into,
Yeah, well, I was fortunate enough to have a correspondence with Steve Ditko in the latter part of his life. And I did send him my work. And he wrote back. I actually cheekily asked him for a quote for, I did this little boutique book of my art called Swim Any Purpose, and asked him for a quote. And he actually wrote back and gave me a quote, which was, he's never done it. I don't think he's done it before or since. But you could see that I was hugely influenced by his stuff. And also we would have very intelligent conversations about art and stuff. And, he just said, look, I love seeing the new generation take ideas and see what they do with them, because every generation will interpret things in a new way. And that's basically what he had to say about my versions of his Spider-Man and Shade.
Just as an aside there, I just realized you mentioned you were picking up the Beatles singles as they were coming out. And you mentioned about having Steve Ditko comics yesterday in our conversation. Do you actually have Steve Ditko comics off the shelf as they were coming out as well?
I caught a few of the later ones just because of my age, but I had an older brother, Jim, who used to buy them off the rack. So I used to, I'd read, he used to get about 10 Marvel or DC comics a month. So Spider-Man was always my first to read, as drawn by Ditko. Doctor Strange was kind of so weird. When you're a kid, Doctor Strange is so weird that it was like, now I think it's the great masterpiece of 60s comic book is the Eternity storyline that Ditko basically wrote and Stan Lee dialogued. It's fantastic, and I really highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It's a terrific story.
I actually have a collection of them. I picked up on the thing, but I must get into them, because that was when they were using that Marvel method at the time, I think, wasn't it? It was,
Ditko basically invented Doctor Strange, and Stan Lee wrote the dialogue. But Ditko invented the whole concept. That's why, as a piece of magical writing, I think Ditko's Doctor Strange is as good as Austin Osman Spare's magical drawings, etc. I put it in there at that level.
And it goes to show how important he was for the whole Marvel Universe creation at that point.
Isn't it amazing that those guys like Ditko and Kirby, with Stan Lee, between them, those three guys, and particularly Ditko and Kirby not getting the recognition really till later, they've produced about nearly $20 billion worth of cinematic and television fare for Marvel Comics and DC Comics. Incredible, isn't it? And
that's
those guys just sat at desk drawing for peanuts and got nothing in return.
Hopefully, I think that's turning now. We see their name pop up on shows these days.
Obviously, the corporations had to be shamed into it. Otherwise, believe me, they wouldn't give them a dime.
And there was another character here, actually. Is this a Ditko character as well? It screams Ditko to me, but it's not one I'm familiar with.
No, it's a character I was going to do for 2000 AD as a black superhero called Yo-Yo, and I was just getting to the sort of end of my kind of tether with comics. Comics basically involves sitting at a desk on your own all day, watching the world go by your window. And at the age of 30, I still hadn't really had a big comic hit and wasn't making much money. There's not much money in comics if you're not, getting big hits. And I thought, I've kind of said what I've got to say with comics. And then the world of pop videos and everything else opened up to me, and I just moved into that. by the age of 30, I felt like I need to start earning some money now, because I don't want to be some destitute ex-comic artist in my 50s. You know?
You mentioned pop videos. There's an array of work here, pop videos.
Yes. Well, I went into pop videos. I just happened to do some work for the leading pop video director of the era, called Steve Barron. And he did all these amazing, you know, the classic pop videos. Billie Jean Is Not My Lover, you know, that Michael Jackson dancing on the squares. And this was, say, how I present artwork for him. This was a video for Bad that it didn't make it in the end, but as this version did get made. But that's how I was sort of creating the thing. It was going to be a dance routines of Michael dancing with, you know, broken up motorbikes and Busby Berkeley, Day of the Dead skeletons and wind up toys. There were 3 different sequences in it. So I visualized stuff for Steve, and he'd love it, because he could just walk into meetings with Michael Jackson, show him the stuff. And to me, it was like, all this stuff was really coming out of comics. It all just became easy, because comics is so hard compared to everything else.
Interesting.
You know?
And you mentioned
I must say, one of the interesting things about Steve Barron is, which leads us into animation and the animation Dingle festival, is that one of the crucial videos that Steve Barron made was Money for Nothing and the Chicks for Free, which was for Dire Straits, that song, where a company called The Mill, and there was these 3 guys working in The Mill, Ian Pearson, Gavin Blair, and Phil Mitchell. They used to do all those spinning gold football logos, you know, all that kind of stuff, and do a load of post-work production. But they harbored the idea of doing a computer animated TV series, and nobody had done it before. And it was like, they thought, you know, if everybody said, oh, you can't do that, it'd be too expensive, it's impossible. So as a dry run for it, Steve Barron commissioned them in those days, the budgets for rock videos were huge, like $1 million, stuff like that. He commissioned them to do a rock video. And this was by Dire Straits, is the first CGI rock video, non kind of corporate logo type animation.
I have some of it here now. I'll just give it a play. Yeah, like that's where it all begins. You know, you can see where everything's going from here. And Steve Barron went on to do an awful lot of stuff with this technology. But I think the next one he worked on with you was that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Sorry, let me just pass that forward there.
Right. Yeah. So at that time, Hollywood was looking for new blood in the directing field, and audiences now won't get how pervasive MTV was and how much music was everywhere. Every time you walked into a pub, MTV was playing on TV. Everywhere, music was everywhere, and MTV was huge. It was like the internet is now. And so those rock video directors got headhunted by Hollywood to direct the new wave of feature films that Hollywood was planning on. And I got a call from Steve Barron one day saying, have you heard of anything called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? And I said, yeah, it's like this huge comic. It's an indie comic and it's massive. He said, I've just been asked to direct a feature film of it. What do you reckon? I said, do it, man. It's going to be huge. So he said, do you want to work on it with me and sort it out? I said, yeah. So I did. The advantage of going into that, my first big Hollywood feature, was it was coming out of comics. I got comics. I knew all about the Turtles just from, you know, being around and reading a few of the comics and stuff. And the idea was to somehow translate that comic into a feature film, which worked back then. If you look at it now, it probably looks quite crude, but then it was really huge. And that was a massive, massive hit, as I said before.
Oh, it holds up. It doesn't look crude at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it for 20 years. But you know, I started off, you know, doing the storyboards, visualizing the turtles, you know, the layouts of their lair, all that kind of all the sewage stuff. You know, just getting the right vibe for it and giving it the comic book sort of look.
There is a real graphic feel to these. Yeah, you can clearly see your comic book background playing in these. Yeah, really nice stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed doing storyboards at that time. It was new, and plus I was learning about how films are made. it was bringing me into a whole new industry. You know, I'm starting at the bottom, but you know, it's fun. It was a lot of fun. I'd like to say about Steve Barron is that after he did that MTV video for Dire Straits, like, you know, that was huge as well. That was massive, that video, everywhere. And the guys behind it said, look, we've got this idea for a TV series called Reboot. And Steve Barron said, all right. So he funded the development of Reboot from his company, Limelight Films. They did a bit of test work on it. Steve then asked me, will you come in and design it? Because it looks a bit, you know, these guys weren't designers. They're brilliant innovators, but they didn't have the kind of, you know, design kind of look right. So I came in and designed Reboot for them. And it was really, you know, at the time, Reboot was like so modern and new. And we went to ABC in America with it, and they said, yes.
I'm just going to skip ahead to it here visually. You please keep talking about Reboot. I'm just going to skip. I have it in the slideshow, so I'm going to skip ahead.
Oh, all right. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Turtles. Yeah, more storyboards. Oh, yeah, all right. I'll just say you've got Coneheads up there. Steve Barron did Coneheads after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I got hired by a guy called Lorne Micheals. Now, we never had Saturday Night Live over in England, so I didn't know who he was or much about Saturday Night Live. I'd heard about it, and I knew Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, those guys from the movies. So Steve Barron said, all right, I'm going to do Coneheads. Brendan, can you basically invent an entire Coneheads world for me? I said, yeah, easy, because that's what you do when you do comics. You're inventing worlds out of nothing. And all those, you know, all those hours you spent at school looking out the window, daydreaming and thinking up weird crap, finally pays off. So I got hired by Lorne Micheals, who, you know, I got hired in about 2 minutes by him. He said, so you want, you know, and I didn't realize he's the biggest entertainment guy in America. And I didn't really know who he was, and just sort of sauntered into his office at Paramount Pictures. He said, so you're gonna create a whole Coneheads world for us, are you? I said, yeah, I was thinking of doing this, this, and this, and just told him a bunch of stuff. He laughed a couple of times when I said what I wanted to do. He said, you're hired.
Brilliant. Easiest interview ever.
It was bizarre. And then I ended up spending a year at, you know, it was my first Hollywood actual studio movie. And it was a great thrill walking through the big gates of Paramount. And the security guy said, oh, Mr. McCarthy, your office is down the end of Dick Van Dyke Drive. You know, it was like Mega City, you know, whether you name the blocks after celebrities. And I was in the Carl Malden block.
Oh, nice.
And believe it or not, and I thought, this is bizarre. And so I had this tiny little office you could just get a chair in. And looking out my window with the giant words OD. And it was the tail end of the Hollywood sign, you know. So I was looking at the Hollywood sign thinking, okay, I'm in Hollywood. Weird. And I just ended up just doing loads of drawings and met all those guys just to hang out with Dan Aykroyd, who's totally into UFOs and weird stuff.
Yeah, he's big into ufology, or ufology, I think.
Oh, yeah, I should end up chatting with him and met all those guys, Adam Sandler. They were just starting as their first movie, and they were just starting out, and they were great. I mean, one guy in particular was really nice, who tragically got killed, a guy called Phil Hartman. Who was in the movie Coneheads. He was a regular on the Saturday Night Live show, but he was really into comics. He used to be a graphic designer before he went into comedy. So he knew all the Marvel stuff, the DC. We just spend hours just rapping about
that's cool.
Gil Kane and Jack Kirby, you know. So this is like those pictures to show you what my drawings were, how I did the visuals, and there's some clips, just some stills from the movie, so you can see how closely it resembled what I do, you know.
You can really see some more comic book influence there with the logo you're working on there as well. It feels like it's something that could be on a chest of a superhero, you know?
Yeah, well, I'm very into logos. So when I do movies, I often will develop a logo just for the internal use of the movie, and we put it on all the notepaper and they just like all that stuff. They like all that. It brands the movie for the crew, you know. T-shirts were made out of it and stuff like that. You know.
Will I go straight to Reboot, or was it the cover so much up in between? I just want to skip through some more. So
what else? Yeah, see what's coming next.
Pinocchio's next.
Pinocchio, yeah, that was quite a nice film. You know, yeah, it was quite a moderate hit. You know, nice film actually. It's got some quite good stuff in it, some good sequences. You know,
again, wasn't it?
That was Steve Barron's third movie, and he asked me again to do it, visualize Pinocchio. So that was quite good fun, creating a brand new Pinocchio for a live action movie.
more boards and
Well,
character design?
and again, designing the Pinocchio, getting, if you can sort of, how close in the end Pinocchio looked to what I designed, to get a different look to the Disney one. That was the thing we had to do. And Pinocchio himself was animatronic, and I worked a lot with the Jim Henson workshop. Henson, they were really great to work with as well. So, but that'd be like a sheet of my material, the kind of stuff they would get at the studios, to see how things were going. Steve Barron liked me to, can you put together me a few sheets where we just work in progress? So he could send it to the studio. It would keep them off his back. They'd look at it and go, oh, this looks fantastic, great. Keep going. It's just the politics of filmmaking.
Did you find like that maybe when the puppeteers had to create a puppet, it would kind of restrict what you could draw? Maybe things couldn't move a certain way you were drawing it, or was that fine? They'd find a way to make it work?
Well, if you're storyboarding a puppet, you're going to storyboard it so it's not, stretching or something. You just know it's a puppet, so you're going to draw it appropriately. There's not an issue with that, really. No.
Perfect. Next up was Thunderbirds. Sorry, there's still a little bit to go to before I get to people. But I have to say, like, this is Mobius influence all day, right? Are you a big Mobius fan?
Oh, I am, of course. I mean, he's, I'm not in his league. But he's one of the greatest ever, isn't he? He's as good as Kirby. That was very heartbroken that this film version of this film never got made. Director on this one was Peter Hewitt. It was going to be made in Britain by Working Title Films, and this was a sequence where they try out the Thunderbirds 1 and 2, and they just go on this giant race around the planet and zoom through. I think that was Neo Tokyo or something, New Tokyo or something, and hence all the the Asian writing and stuff. I have no idea what the writing means. I just copied it off like Chinese food wrappers or something. And they wanted to keep the spirit of the original Thunderbirds, but just revamp it, keep the kind of that 50s 60s design with the fins and stuff, but just spin it a bit, and so that's Thunderbird 3, but give it a bit more of a sleek look. So these were my takes on the different vehicles and also the costumes as well.
Yeah, the costumes are very good too. It feels like something of an X-Men, a 90s X-Men show. It's really cool.
Yeah, I mean that was I can't, Alan. Oh yeah, he was the guy to Thunderbird 3, I think. Oh, Thunderbird 4. That's right, the underwater one. And that was great fun designing those guys, and also just quite simply doing things like taking the T of the Thunderbird and building that into the costume. So that's a very simple design motif, but I thought it looked really good.
Really good.
It never got made though, and they made that really bad version. Did you see?
I haven't seen this. No.
They just scrapped the whole movie when the studio got panicked and said, we need to cast it with kids. And they cast these set of kids as the Thunderbirds. Oh. The vehicles look good in the movie, but the film itself was not very good, and it tanked.
That's a big move to make in a panic. It can never really end well, That's a huge
Studios are always doing it. They're always second guessing themselves. They won't. They live. All these execs are living in a state of total fear, because if the film they do tanks, they get the chop.
Yeah. There's someone always kind of at risk putting their name on one of the products, and someone get the blame for it.
Yeah, that was I spent a year on the IMAX thing you've got up on the screen now. That was. I got involved with IMAX, and they wanted to do a 3D animated version of Gulliver's Travels, which I wrote and designed, and I was hoping to co-direct, but I completely shaped it, met up with IMAX, used to go to their offices in New York, and it was really interesting because it was the first time I actually designed 3D, and I don't mean 3D meaning CGI, although it was going to be a CGI mini feature, about 40 minutes in length. It was also dealing with the actual 3D objects moving in space around your head and stuff as you're the viewer. So that was fantastic. Plotting the interocular distance on objects in space that don't exist was very bizarre and real. It was a challenge, but I really enjoyed it. But again, in the end they decided, we're not going to do animation now, we're going to go over to marine life or something. I don't know, whatever, how things go. But it was a year. Again, a lot of half the projects I've worked on have never got made. but they've been big learning curves. I've learned so much about how things work.
What was the big thing from this show?
Sorry, of Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah, your big learning curve. What was maybe the take home
Well,
factor?
IMAX 3D, and well, how to apply 3D CGI and add three-dimensional, the reality of 3D. You put on your 3D glasses and objects. How to work with objects in space. I mean, when I first met George Miller, he'd been thinking about 3D. It was starting to circulate around Hollywood. Maybe 3D should come back again. And we had a great conversation about, 3D and the grammar of 3D, how you can't, you have to keep things in the center of the screen, how you can't, if you've got objects moving in space to your left, you can't then alter the depth of field and then make the eye look into the back into the screen, because what it creates is a kind of motion sickness in the viewer.
Right.
You learn all this kind of stuff. And so there's a whole grammar to how you construct 3D, which you can see how George used that in how he composed Mad Max Fury Road, where he centered most of the action. So your eye wasn't jumping all the time left to right, because originally sequences from Mad Max Fury Road were to be shot in 3D. So there's 3 of the big action sequences in Mad Max were originally going to be shot in 3D. In the end, they scrapped that, and then they did, that fake 3D they apply afterwards. Wow. So, I'm just saying, it's IMAX Gulliver's Travels allowed me to have, an intelligent conversation about how to do 3D and not make the audience vomit.
Well, actually, that's a good tangent to the next point, because that's an element of technology helping you tell a story that would be relatively new and difficult to figure out. And that leads us really well into Reboot, which was extremely new technology, breaking ground stuff, years before Pixar were doing Toy Story. The only thing I could think of that was kind of close to this in any regard, which still doesn't nearly hit the mark, this, it was Tron, and that was years before. But this was groundbreaking stuff. And please tell us more about what you were doing on Reboot. You were mentioning you were doing designs on this. And I was going into tour of other films. Sorry, but here we go.
Yeah, I created the visuals for Reboot, and you can see obviously it's very colourful and has my signature kind of colour work in it. But that was great. The chance to do something completely innovative and brand new was again, it was a bit like, as I said, in the 80s, the comic scene, when that broke open and it was all creator led. This was the same with, back then CGI was completely creator led, because none of the execs even knew what it was. What's CGI? It was that sort of stuff. And I mean, I was a novice as well, so I was learning off Ian Pearson, Gavin Blair, and Phil Mitchell, the 3 geniuses who figured out how to do computer animation at cost and get it to that standard. And this is a still from, I think, the 2nd season where we got better at it. But just creating a load of characters. I mean, I mean, now I still, when I see it, looking at this now, I still think it looks good. It can come out today and still look all right. One of the things I learned as well is about, if you're doing animation, make the faces interesting, because the faces are what occupy most of the screen time. So don't make the feet interesting, make the faces interesting. So with things like Bob, who's the central character who had the chrome hair, I was looking at, what does the computer do that the animator doesn't have to do to save time and will automatically generate? And one of the things that everybody did in those days, everyone was doing chrome logos, because they were easy to do, because the computer would work out the reflections and put them into the logo. So I said, let's do an experiment with his hair. Let's make his hair chrome, because if they're inside a computer, they can have chrome hair, doesn't matter. And they were going, okay. They hadn't thought of this stuff. And so once we did the chrome hair, that we realized we can get that face looking really interesting and have a load of free movement in the hair that doesn't have to be animated. So that's why the central character had chrome hair. That's purely me saying, can we just try this? Just believe me, try it. And they did it, and bang, straight away. And then, so a little thing I used to then use in the show was, I would, with certain characters, I'd give them interesting hair. Like the character on the right with which looked like orange hair, with the purple skin, her hair is actually static. because static, all you've got to do is animate a static cycle, and then it's in her hair all the time, and you don't have to animate it again. So I was working out, because I'd previously worked at Hanna-Barbera when I was very young on limited animation. I'd got into the mindset of, how do you reuse what you create once? Just reuse it many times, as they used to say. In the internet, they used to say, create once, publish many times. So I applied that to the animation and CGI of, like, create once, use many times. So with Bob's hair, I was getting free animation on the Chrome, and with I forget her name at the moment. The woman with the orange static hair.
Either. I know Bob and Enzo. I can't remember the other character.
Yeah, I can't remember them. I remember most of them.
Hexadecimal and yeah.
Hexadecimal, yeah. One of the things about Hexadecimal, that's the central female character, looks a bit like a bondage queen. But she was the scariest character, because she was a kind of schizophrenic mad character with 7 different Japanese no mask faces that would just keep flipping all the time. And I'm not sure if it is sort of quite suitable for kids' TV, but she was really popular, and she used to terrify. I mean, so many people have told me, "Oh, thanks for terrifying me when I was a 7-year-old watching Reboot." You know, so
there were some moments in that show for me as well. Hexadecimal was all those moments.
Yeah.
But you're just mentioning there about different, like, more interesting faces, and I was going to say, this is such a great exhibition of character design, where, like, so every character has a different silhouette. Just when you mentioned faces, I just had a look at all their faces. All their faces also have a different silhouette. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of bringing design to that far ahead.
Yeah, I mean, with Reboot, I mean, yeah, that's the cover of the DVD, you know, and you see the 2 villains, they're viruses, and Megabyte on the left, and Hexadecimal on the right. Yeah, they were a pretty scary pair.
Yeah, they're great, and there's actually some footage here from the show now as well.
They were playing cards, you know, chewing gum cards, where you get cards with a little lump of chewing gum in them.
You know you've done a great show when there's chewing gum cards with your characters.
Exactly right. Exactly. I also, what was great was I was able to have a hand in all the merchandising. I ended up doing loads of the merchandising for the company, because nobody had done it before. I had a bit of a knowledge of it, and so, you know, it was great just designing, coming up with ideas for merchandising, talking to toy companies. We also did a motion ride of Reboot, which was fantastic as well. You know, one of those capsules you sit in and it tilts.
Yeah.
Syncopated to the visuals. And also we did a Reboot, one of the first games. We did a Reboot game with Electronic Arts, I think it was.
So there was yeah, that was great.
Yeah, Reboot was quite big in its day. It was quite a sensation, except in America, sadly, because ABC, the network ABC who bought it, aired it at something like 7 a.m. or something stupid. And it should really have been on a, you know,
after school.
It should have been 6 p.m. And also stoners would have loved Reboot. You know, I've got a lot of stoners who used to find it that's played at certain times, and they all dug it as well. Yeah, and it was always great. It was interesting seeing, like, you know, 15 years later, seeing Avatar, and then seeing the blue skin character in Avatar, and then the blue skin Bob character from Reboot, how much computer animation had accelerated in you know, rendering capacity, sophistication of textures. I mean, that's what people don't understand with Reboot, is everything was being innovated by us as we were going along. Like the first season, we couldn't afford to do shadows. They were too expensive, so we couldn't put shadows in the first season. By the second season, we'd figured out how to do them, and at cost, you know.
And there must have been some kind of, like, real feeling of, like, breaking new ground when you come across something like that, you know, like, and you can render it in the time you have available to render. And I mean, that's just got to be such a motivation to kind of keep going. You have something different here.
Yeah, let's watch a bit. And I just mentioned this as why I chose this clip is because on one episode we decided to try the Warner Brothers stretch and squash sort of thing. You know, the thing about CGI back then is that it's a bit stiff. It looks like Thunderbird puppets moving. You know, the animation's quite stiff. But this one we decided let's actually stretch the CGI a bit and give it some of that old Warner Brothers Roadrunner stretch and squash.
Very good. Yeah, I nailed it. Really Looney Tunes squash.
Yeah, it's a good sequence.
Guardian.
Let's do it!
Reboot! It's delicious! I'm a biker babe!
Terrific for you, but look at me!
Guardian,
Oh, wait, I'm a guardian now, am I?
we got company.
I'm here now, you rabid rascal, you! Let's get ready to rumble!
He's too fast! We'll never catch him!
Be very, very quiet. I'm hunting raccoon. One wife down, two to go.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, it's our homage to Warner Brothers.
Another side of that show was that every time a GameCube came down, you had a new genre to put the characters in. That must have been another exercise in character design for you.
It was great. Every episode was a brand new design, and what's interesting about that is that I pitched them an idea. Why don't we do a Mad Max game? And we did one called, instead of Mad Max, it was called Bad Bob. And we just we often put loads of references and stuff in the shows that the sharp-eyed would catch. Like in that one there, on the number plate it says 28th, which is the number plate of a little car on the front cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road, for example. Just little things like that. You know, there's loads of references. And after we'd finished the Bad Bob episode of Reboot, I sent it to George Miller with a question mark saying, "Whatever happened to Mad Max?" And you know,
that worked out well.
Yeah, well, 6 months later, he phoned up and said, "What is this stuff?" I said, "Oh, it's computer animation. It's this new show. Blah blah blah." He said, "Do you want to meet up in Hollywood? We're thinking about doing a Mad Max TV show, and maybe you could do, instead of matte paintings, we can build CGI versions of things like ruined skyscrapers and stuff." I said, "Love to." So I went. That's when I first met him, and then eventually from that conversation was born the idea of doing a new Mad Max feature film. So,
you know, we will get to that quickly, very quickly, actually. I'm just going to skip ahead to another production here you worked on.
Shadow Raiders was a Star Wars type based on toy designs. I designed all the characters. There's a little clip coming up where I just show the different character designs. It's basically 4 planets made out of ice, fire, earth, and air. Each have different inhabitants that look like they come from those worlds, and they all have to unite against this Death Star called the War Planet. And that's the gist of it. But this little clip just shows you the different types of character design.
Cryos of ice to planet fire. It is imperative that I speak to your prince.
Go away, Ice Worlder. The prince cares nothing for you or your world.
What I have to say concerns us all. Planet Rock is under attack by a new enemy. I must speak to the prince.
You speak as if we should care. The problem is theirs to resolve.
We've gone the wrong
There's
way.
the guys heading out of rock.
No, they blocked the tunnel.
So they have.
Yeah. Pause that again, skip back one. Do we want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, just War Planets was also known as Shadow Raiders. It was based on a toy line. I developed the show with, in-house at Mainframe. I didn't get involved. I didn't want to production design the whole thing because it was derived from toys. But I did all the characters though, the main characters. So if you look at there's those little drawings at the top you can see and how close then the actual character design is, because when I get involved in character design and CG, I'll do the paper design is still the fastest way to go, just to get approval on the general direction of the character. Mm-hmm. We build the maquettes, then we build these skeletons and structures, and then I get involved in the texture wrapping, everything, just so that we got something really good built, and as I say, I generally tend to give the faces the extra care because that's what's occupying most of your screen time.
Very good. And more use of your color as well. Those kind of stripes of pure, big, like a luminous colors. This show have like mad hues of color that I expect from your work, but like again, another huge development in CG animation.
Yeah, Weirdos was. I did 3 shows for Mainframe. This is the 3rd, and I ended up taking my name off this because even though I developed it and set up the design, the studio that we worked with was so problematical, and we had a lot of problems with what were called, I think it was something like network standards or something. They were this, and the show was basically based on those Big Daddy Roth hot rod cult, 60s culture stuff. And it was based on model kits called Weirdos. So, I designed some really lovely characters. If you look at that one on the left, Davey, the guy on the motorbike, he looks terrific, really like Speed Demon. But the network standards people said, oh, well, he can't be a demon and he can't drive too fast and he has to stop at traffic lights. And it just all they did is incrementally rip the guts out of the show. So the anarchicness of it, the craziness got tempered to the point where I just got really fed up with it all. So I just said, I'm withdrawing from this. I don't really want to be involved anymore. So I just did. Also at that point, Mad Max Fury Road was kicking in, and I said, I'm going to leave and do Mad Max. So see you later, guys. So that was my one. It could have been a great show, just got absolutely gutted.
That's a pity. But then you did move on to Fury Road, which was one of those pieces I think that's come out over the last number of years that I think everyone wishes they got to work on. It's one of those few productions that doesn't seem to have been hampered by anything other than just everyone involved in a production where every step it seems to have gotten more beautiful and more perfect.
That's Fury Road. There was that's actually that initial first graphic you were showing of that vehicle is called a Buzzard. I invented these for the first chase when we were mapping out. Once George Miller, the director, had decided he wanted to do it as one long chase, obviously with breathing points in between, and that we were constructing it as if you like a roller coaster ride. You know how you'd crank people up, then you let go, you have the amazing chase sequence, then you slow it for a bit, build up to the next big chase. Each chase had to be completely different. So what George was looking at me for was to invent new stuff we hadn't seen before, but stuff that would also feel in keeping with Mad Max itself, that world. And I was a huge Mad Max fan. Road Warrior had blown me away as a kid. So the chance to do something, the only thing we shook on was after a year when we got all this down and we can see something, if we don't think this is going to be better than Road Warrior or as good, we're going to flush it and not do it, because the last thing the world needs is a disappointing Mad Max film. But we were so enthused about the material that we were creating. George loved so much of the stuff I was doing that, he was just full on with it and said, no, I've done 3 of these. This one feels like it could be the best. Brilliant. This is a picture of the day, me and George, that's George on the left, me on the right, when we finished actually working the story out. And we used these things called electro boards, which are whiteboards where you can print out what's on the board. And so we spent the first 6 months locked in a room working on these whiteboards. working the story out, coming up with crazy ideas, just really just blue sky thinking about what could happen in the film. And then gradually through these pictograms where we could sum up the movie at a glance, you could look at it and go, okay, that's the whole movie now summed up in one image. And so George found these very helpful because he could go and get a sense of the balance of the movie, and have we got too little of this? Do we have too much of that? What do we? And so we'd save things like the pole cats, the guys bending on the poles, and we'd left them for the final chase because we knew that, well, they're going to be good, so don't reveal them before then,
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that.
I think you have a picture of the polecats here, actually, but just before we get to it, I've
Yeah.
noticed some of these board panels, there's two names. Did you split the storyboarding team to have two borders on a sequence or something, or did someone look after colors while someone else did lines, or what was that?
I'll tell you, that particular picture is a lovely picture. What we were doing was the first year, it was myself and George Miller essentially locked in a room together, and we just worked the whole story out together. And because I'm a comic book guy, I could design it as I went along.
Mm-hmm.
So by the end of the year, we had the movie written and designed. We had a loose script and the designs. You wanted a coherent design to go into the boarding sequence with, because then you're hiring storyboard guys, and everybody's got to draw the same thing, so you don't want everybody drawing different stuff. So there was a practical reason for doing that. This was a drawing I liked. It was drawn by Mark Sexton, an Australian storyboard guy, and then I painted it up and gave it the razzmatazz. So that's just a nice picture. And then I have another one by the other main storyboard artist called Peter Pound, who's an Australian. Yeah, that's Peter Pound's one. Again, he drew he drew it in line, and I added the colors and the thing.
And then later on.
Yeah, that's just purely me. That one. That's a just a shot. That was back when Furiosa had hair. And the motif then with the Necro Boys, as they were called, they then became the War Boys. We were looking at bullet holes, the idea of the shattered windscreen motif on his face, if you can see it, right in the middle of his forehead. And the more bullet holes they would have on their body, bullet hole tattoos, meant the more kills they had. So that was something we settled on, and gradually we lost that towards engine parts and scarification on the body.
It's that kind of Brendan McCarthy motif of the bullseye at the circles as well. It's I love it.
Yeah.
Here's the polecats you were talking about.
That's an early version of the polecats. I just did them. I would do them up. That was an idea that came really easily. George walked into the studio one morning. We were, we were just getting, about halfway through the film. We'd done 2 or 3 months on the film so far. Mm-hmm. And he walked in he'd torn an image out of a magazine and said, "Can you do anything with that?" And I said, "What's this?" And it was a picture of an acrobat on the end of a pole. And I immediately got what he was looking for, because I talked extensively to him about Thunderdome and the whole thing of the bungee action, which gave him the vertical axis of action as well as the usual horizontal action. Because we talked about Asian films and how they leap into the air and stuff. Mm-hmm. But we knew that Mad Max was a film that was real, has a realism, which meant gravity existed. So that was out of the question. So in Thunderdome, he was able to do it through the bungees. And so with Fury Road, the poles, I immediately thought, I know what he wants. He wants the diagonal vertical action on the action, so that it will be a new dynamic in the action later in the film. So the idea was putting the pole on a vehicle, and they drive up to vehicles and board them from above like pirates. So he had the core idea. I finished it off, called them polecats, and said, "There you go, George." And that idea took about 5 minutes. And it's one of the best bits in the movie. So just go to show you, sometimes a good idea, you'll notice that as a creator, sometimes they come in hard and strong, and you go, right, that's it, and it doesn't need changing.
It is funny how often you go back to your first concept, your first draft stuff, Yeah. There's another still or concept on the Necro Boys.
Yeah, and you can see how it's going towards the white-faced look. Mm-hmm. Something I wish they had done actually was that I'd had there used to be when I was a kid, used to get metal jet planes and warplanes or plastic ones in Airfix hobby kits. and toy trains, little trains and things. And I thought, wouldn't they, it'd be interesting if they had sort of attached themselves to their skin, like skin piercing and stuff. So I had one character who was covered in a flotilla of war jets, little plastic ones, they're about an inch across.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
That didn't make it into the movie, but I think it would have been a good look.
Could be one of those things that'll come up on another thing you do down the line or something. That's a really good idea.
Never know. I think, apparently they're making some new Mad Max films. So if Furiosa, the new prequel he's doing called Furiosa, you never know. They definitely have mocked up some of the ideas that did get used in Fury Road or in Furiosa.
We're going to show a clip now that actually features Furiosa quite a lot.
Yeah, and this sequence is I just thought it might be nice because this is one that I was really involved in. It's where I invented the idea of the buzzards, the buzzsaws. The idea was let's ape wildlife footage where you get sort of hyenas circling a big bison and how they take it down by going for biting its legs. And so that was the idea behind this. We'd use the wildlife footage. We looked at a lot of that of hyenas and jackals circling big animals, how they take them down. Once they immobilize them, they can pick them off. And that's the dynamic of the action in this sequence.
Very good, very good. Here we go.
Off her back! Mama! That's my head!
Outstanding stuff. Like that's so good. It's crystal clear storytelling, so exciting as well,
Yeah, he does. George does it's one of the most, it's probably the most prepared film I've ever worked on. His discipline is fantastic. And it took 10 years to get that film made, which is insane. It went up and down all the time. From Mel Gibson, then he's out, then it became Heath Ledger, then he died, then finally Tom Hardy. People like Brad Pitt turned it down. Can you believe it?
But it didn't get any worse for it. I think the right people wwere there at the right time for that.
Yeah, in the end, that's the strange thing, isn't it? Is that in the end, it all worked out all right. It came out at the right time, and it's had a big cultural impact. So it worked really well. It worked much. It's a great movie. It's probably overall the best of the Mad Max films. And although personally, I'm not sure that we beat the end truck chase in the Mel Gibson Road Warrior 2. I think it's fantastic. Yeah, if you go look at that end truck, because it's so raw, those first two Mad Max films were made on shoestrings and have that guerrilla filmmaking quality to them. They're very gritty. Mm-hmm. But listen, that's not to diminish Fury Road, which I think is a superb piece of work. And I'm very proud. Listen, what's weird is sitting around with George, shooting the breeze and just saying, what about if this happened? And laughing and saying, yeah, let's try it. and then seeing it in a film 10 years later, and it looks amazing. And you think, wow, that worked a lot. So again, I learned a lot about what works on screen, what doesn't. You know?
Very good. Did that play into, as we're going to go into now, your comics going forward? You kind of went back to comics, and we're going to have to maybe go through this pretty quickly. I'm aware we're going over our time.
Okay.
But did you find that like your work in film and what you have to show on screen, did that play any kind of intelligence to how you planned out your panels going back into comics again? And did you find that maybe so many years of in film, did that slow down how quick you were picking up the pencil again and getting through the draftsmanship stuff again?
The big effect that working in the film and TV industry had 15 years after not doing comics. Yeah, sure. Comics is very labor intensive drawing. So I had to get my drawing muscle back up to speed. But it had changed how I view comics in that because I'd worked in film and television, I didn't want to produce comics that looked like film and television, which is so many comics now are basically film storyboards so they can sell the comic as a TV show or movie. So I just wanted to go back to just comics being purely comics. And I took a very, and this offer from DC came out of the blue. Just after I finished Mad Max and I was clicking my heels around Hollywood trying to sell something, DC phoned up and say, listen, do you want to, we're doing a series called Solo, we're letting the artists do whatever they want. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And so it got me back into comics. And because of the distance away from comics, I had a sort of a slightly different view to comics again, and created these very different looking pages where I was combining text and pictures in different ways that weren't filmic.
There's you clearly kept in with comics during your time in film, because like this page screams Ghost World to me. Was that an influence to you?
Yeah, of course, yeah. This was a satire of Ghost World. That's the band page. World's Finest is the page. It's the only page in this that DC asked me to change. It's changed the title and characters, because apparently you couldn't have two kids dressed up in superhero outfits like Batman and Superman looking at their dad's porn. So, so we had to change it. That's like, I didn't mind. So that's right. On the second page there, you see on the right, they're in different coloured costumes with different insignias.
And then there's some of your covers.
Yeah, that was my sort of pastiche 60s Batman cover. So that was just you can go through these fast if you like. You know,
I will. I'll skim through them, but there's bits I want to talk about them, because there's elements here to the Batman comic that I think is such a good cover. You know, it's such a good, crisp, clear use of single color. You know, you really tone back your big psychedelic use on this just for an impact of your cover. But you seem to do this in all your covers. Your cover seems to play that role of catching the eye quite quick.
Yeah, in that one, I'm pastiching a 1960s cover. So I just coloured it like they would have coloured one of those covers.
And then we go into kind of the psychedelia that where you were working on with Spider-Man.
Yeah, Spider-Man. Marvel then, after DC, it was really weird. Just thinking, I'd like to do some comics again. DC call, and then Marvel get onto me. When Solo gets released, Marvel say, hey, will you do something for us? And I said, any chance of Doctor Strange? And the editor was a guy who was editing Spider-Man. He said, if you can put Spider-Man in it, I can sell it. I said, I'd love to do Spider-Man as well. It'll be the two Ditko characters. Yeah. And so I did Spider-Man Fever. Again, just like really enjoying things like how to use the sound effects. Again, letting the Doctor Strange sequences really open up on the psychedelia. And like here, you know, looking at artists like the surrealist Max Ernst and using his collage techniques to create, you know, something different to Ditko, but also, you know, something, you know, bizarre and surreal.
That's what they say, great artists steal, don't they? So you don't just take something from a guy, you understand it and use it, you know?
Yeah, that's it. It's exactly right. Getting inside the guts of somebody else, and then you know what space they were creating from.
And then there's your Swimming Purpose, which is a difficult book to get a hold of.
Yeah, that's an alternative cover. It was about I was sort of in my late 40s and sort of starting to think, you know, time's starting to run out a bit. Hence the footprint with the water coming into it, and realizing that I had all this unpublished work, because I'm a bit compulsive when it comes to drawing. So I had about 200 pages of unpublished drawings, and I thought I'll put them all together with a couple of my published stuff into a little boutique book. So I got together with a designer, again, Steve Cook, and we I just wanted to do. There was a vogue at the time for artist books, so I just wanted to do a book how I wanted to do a book, and it's quite. I only published 500 of them, and they go for about $800 on eBay now. They're getting pretty expensive, and I sold them for $25 at the time.
If only you go back now. That'll take us on to Saucer of Zilk, which looks like you've done the cover, but this is work with yourself and Ewing and O'Grady. I think Len's work on this, like, it feels like he was a fan of yours all his life, because he seems to echo exactly what you used to do with your tints, how you use your colors the whole way through. I think this is a really great example of collaboration in comics.
Yeah, Len's been fantastic on the Saucer of Zilk. He's to me, he's an equal partner in it, in terms of there's the writer, there's me, and there's Len. We're all sort of, the creative team, like a group creating. So often with Len, most of his pages are great, and I leave them alone. Sometimes Len will give me a page and I think this feels a bit maybe undercooked. I can add stuff to it. So because in this sequence, the Saucer of Zilk is visiting a guy called the Tailor of Tales, the narrator of the story, I dropped in then the jeans at the top with the buttons.
Very good.
And just as a way of as a little motif, again, using, when I talked about Freakwave, using the gutter to give you a bit more of a comment visually on what's happening. It's terrific work with Len. I tend to sort of slightly remix his work a bit, just to give it a bit more of a kind of acid electronic vibe. I mean, this is Len. I don't think I touched this much at all. This is Len, pure Len O'Grady colouring. The Saucer of Zilk was an idea I'd had for a while. I pitched it to 2000 AD. I had the basic idea, I had the characters and a kind of rough story of the world. Mm-hmm. And they put me in touch with a writer called Al Ewing, who's a very funny writer, an inventive writer. So that was a good mix with Al. And then I got Len in. They suggested Len for as the colours, and it worked. It just came together beautifully. And again, here's me. Len is doing the colours. Mm-hmm. I might then, when I get the colours back from him, I might add in things like the occult symbolism here in the yellow, or the demon above the gate. There's things like that I'll drop in if I feel, I can take it a bit further.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much a collaboration between myself and Len on the visuals.
That's great, but yeah.
Listen, I really
show the movement these days for people to include the colorist name on the comic book is such an obvious thing to be doing, as opposed to something they should be striving and arguing for.
Oh, I'm totally pro colorist. I think they're, to take them out of the shadows and give them, it's just crazy. It's like they can't, it's just sort of backward, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. They're such a big part of the book,
Yeah.
There's more work then here, but with Dark Horse this time.
Yeah, Deleted was a kind of guy gets abandoned inside a game. This is some Dr. Fate stuff. This time with the colorist Mark Harrison.
Skip ahead there.
Yeah, Mark Harrison on this one. Deleted, I did all that one. Mark Harrison
type stuff.
Yeah, the thing is, with things like, say, the Deleted, I'm because it's inside a game, I want to give a cyber internet look to the visuals. Hence, it's got that slightly abrasive digital look. So that's the look, that suits that strip. If you go to Dr. Fate, that's a bit more luscious, and this is beautiful work. He's got a slightly different style to Len, very cinematic. He's done a lot of movie work. And Mark's a fantastic colorist. He's also a good comic book artist in his own right. So I was lucky to get him, and I keep my inks really simple. And if you notice, there's a lot of open space in this so that Mark can do his stuff. So I let the colorist breathe. And then I'll drop in design elements like the white circle at the top and things like that. The page sometimes needs a little bit of something in it.
Very good. I like the little textures in there as well. And
yeah.
These scream Brendan McCarthy too, just that use of color,
Yeah, these are.
It's just
that's just bog standard Brendan stuff. It was great to do Dr. Fate, and here's Len. This is Len again on the
and Chopper.
on Chopper. Yeah, and I was, because it's set in Australia, it involves Aboriginal tribe who I'm very interested in their culture. I've been studying their stuff for about 30 years. Some people said, oh, it's cultural appropriation. I said, it's not, it's cultural appreciation. It's like how beautiful their work is and how lovely the color schemes and their dreamtime mythology is. I mean, I've been really into it. And so again, the use of the gutters to suggest bring a kind of the arid open space of the desert, and then you've got the more cluttered feel in the judges section, you know, with the background, which is kind of like an Andy Warhol background.
Yeah, it is.
And then you've got that very open Len O'Grady painted background with the Aboriginal motifs in the sky.
Did you add those motifs, or was that Len as well?
No, that was Len.
Very good. He really understands what you're about.
Oh yeah, we're very we've done enough stuff together now that we're quite symbiotic in he kind of gets me and I get him. This is just a quick look at a new strip that hasn't been published yet. It'll be coming out. It's a sneak peek, called Knacker of the Stars, which is a sort of 1950s Dan Dare Britain with a curmudgeonly police inspector. Again, that's Len colouring, me adding a few little bits here and there. But you know, part of it's a lovely little comedic sort of Fawlty Towers type comedy strip for 2000 AD. It's my last thing I've done.
So when can we look forward to this?
I don't know. I think in a few months.
Very good, very good. I'll be all over that. Here's the Milligan McCarthy book you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, it's a great collection. If you can catch one, I really highly recommend it. It's called The Best Of.
It's definitely only something I got aware of as I was prepping for this, actually. So it's on order. And then there's a few things we're working on up into a new thing as well.
It's kind of since I moved to Ireland, I was thinking about an Irish superhero and something set in Dublin about a homeless kid still under one of the bridges, because Dublin is not short of homeless people. So it's about a kid who lives in a box, and I won't go into there's too much of the story, but I live in a cardboard box in the underpass. I help people. They tell me I need a bath, you know. So it's just that kind of sort of downtrodden kind of social commentary type hero, but funny, you know.
Yeah. Well, you can see your sense of humor and a lot of stuff. That's the dadaism, you know, where they're probably making fun of. Like there's a bit of humor and things like that. You mentioned dadaism earlier on. Is that like you know, where they're making fun of current things going on?
Well, it's kind of, you're mixing social comment and satire with you know, with a bit of bite as well. I just included these because I keep sketchbooks, and a lot of my ideas I have come out of just doodling in sketchbooks. And the graphic novel, my most recent self-written graphic novel, Dream Gang, came from just these drawings, you know, where I was thinking about a floating lighthouse as a vehicle, and gradually I started to do more drawings. That was the pitch for Dream Gang that I sent to Dark Horse Comics. There's the cover, there's the front cover of the graphic novel. They travel through these Gideon's footprints, these footprints that you can walk down that take you to different dreams, how dreams are interconnected by footprints. It's a very surreal, imaginative story.
This looks like we're reaching peak McCarthy here.
Yeah, it's very, very, very influenced by Yellow Submarine, Alice in Wonderland, that kind of stuff. Another page from it.
And is this some of your older work? Are you doing any of this these days as well?
Yeah, just to wrap up, I studied painting at college when I was a kid, and I continue to do my own painting, which I find with painting, it can be very loose, and you can do stuff that you wouldn't normally do in comics or film, but eventually you might stumble across something and then it feeds back into the comics, back into the film. So for me, painting is an R&D research development area where I just produce images randomly for no reason, just my own pleasure. That's me at college. Here's you know, how I used to draw back then, very influenced by the early Hockney 60s work, which I used to love.
Ralph Steadman, was he an influence at the time, or is he around even at that time?
Well,
Ralph Steadman of you know, Fear and Loathing.
Ralph Steadman, of course, he was a big influence, yeah. And there's the painting that came from the sketch. Again, this was one of my graduate show paintings. So you can see the comic influence as well as the early Hockney.
Oh,
yeah. Then there's you had coming up. What's the next one?
Right.
Yeah, that was again a sort of quite a psychedelic painting. Don't tell me to explain it. It's just surrealism, pop surrealism. It's called these days.
But there's something kind of Ernst about it. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something Max Ernst about this, and I think there was another piece I had of yours earlier on that looked very similar. Don't know what it is. I quite like them.
Yeah. Max Ernst is a big influence on me. This was again. I just do these paintings. They're often mysterious to me. I often don't know what they're about, but neither do I want to know what they're about. The mystery is kind of part of what attracts me to them. And I generate sigils, and I put one in the corner there.
Sorry.
This one is just a drawing based on. It's strange. I'm old enough to remember old money. You wouldn't be. You're all euros and cents, whereas in England they used to have pounds, shillings, and pence. But so I was just doing a little riffing. I was just thinking about old money. So I did a drawing from that.
Nice. And is this? Oh, there's the other piece I was talking.
Yeah, that's a kind of an abstract, organic felt abstract. As you say, quite influenced by Max Ernst.
What's this piece from?
This is a technique I developed with using sellotape. We know when you put a piece of clear tape on a magazine and tear it up, it takes a piece of the image with it. Mm-hmm. And then you stick the tape together. Gradually, I build up these fields made from I'll get through rolls and rolls of tape. And so this was done when I was at art college, when punk rock had its own chewing gum cards of Johnny Rotten. So I took a few of the cards, placed them on paper, and then covered them in sellotape and random images.
Very good. And there's a few paintings.
This is from a series I did for Crisis. It ran on the back page of Crisis. It was one of my paintings, and they published it. Sort of more of an expressionistic type thing. Again, I like drawing on pastels. This is colored paper using color pastels, which I enjoy. Just see things like that. Well, then when I look at the coloring of the lettering and things like that at the base, that's now giving me a lot of ideas of how to do coloring in comics, in terms of coloring the lettering in comics, which I haven't applied yet, but my next comic, I hope to use that technique.
It's interesting how one medium is influencing how you use the other.
Yeah. Here's a drawing where I did a drawing, and then I just photoshopped it and added Photoshop effects through it all and filters till I built up layers. So that's an analog drawing, but with digital effects and coloring through it.
Very good.
And here's something I've been looking at the painter Frank Auerbach, who used to layer on levels and levels of oil and did these really built up portraits. And for the first time, I've started drawing digitally, but not, with a pen, mm-hmm. but more with the airbrush device, and then putting it through curves and, really pushing the colors and where the computer creates the line itself, and just doing layers and layers of it. So I went through probably about 50 layers of stuff just to get that portrait of a friend of mine. So that was quite a breakthrough for me, because it's my first purely digital painting where I haven't drawn something first in analog and then brought it into Photoshop. And it's stuff I'd like to do more like that now, because I think it feels like a painting, but it's purely digital.
And you were saying the process is quite organic, and organic is something I always kind of think of looking at your work, especially now I haven't gone through so much of it. You have a very organic line, so that process must have felt kind of like you were at home.
Yeah, well, as I say, this painting was a bit of a breakthrough for me, because it's the first time where I felt the digital was actually me and the computer were creating something together, and it felt I couldn't have done it on my own, and the computer certainly couldn't have done it on its own. So it was. It feels interesting. I want to do more portraits like this and see where it goes. It feels valid as a painting,
Certainly looks valid. It's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think we're going to have to call it a day now. We've gone well over our time. Brendan, I'd like to thank you very much for giving up so much of your time to me. Me just throwing questions and having you go through all your work. I'd also like to thank Scott, who's in the background helping out. I'd like to thank Mark and Morris, and I'd love to thank the team at the Dingle Festival. Thanks a million for having me over and do this and getting to talk to Brendan. I really appreciate it. It was brilliant. And enjoy the rest of the festival. There's a lot going on. Thanks very much. Goodbye.